Hello and welcome to another tutorial. In this video, we'll be covering portraits and more specifically, a quick starter guide for them. So a lot of the content here so far has been somewhat more of an intermediate level, but I wanted to take the chance and also upon quite a few requests to do a talk, or rather to touch on a topic that's a bit more basic, right? In a way, because of course portraits can be really complicated and there can be a lot of stuff to them that even I have not really mastered, or even some things that I haven't really even understood. But in this video, we won't be touching on a lot of the very advanced stuff. The goal here is really just to give a quick rundown on some of the very basic things that you can start doing and start paying attention to that will help you a lot in the long run. So let us get into it right now. So firstly, portraits. Why do we do them? Excuse the space. So of course, right, this is quite intuitive. A lot of times when we just begin in art, we always want to like try and express, like draw our favorite characters, usually, right? That's kind of like the approach that I took personally. I just wanted to draw characters, and of course, when you talk about characters, intuitively speaking, the easiest and most straightforward thing to do would be to kind of like draw the face and focus on that area, right? That for you to explore. So, right, number one, it's easy to approach, right? For example, if you want to draw an entire character versus just a face, excuse me, it will definitely feel easier, and in some ways, it is simpler to just draw like a very focused portrait. Right, number two, it's also part of the interest in the face area, because as people, we look at others and we generally pay a lot of attention to the face compared to other parts of the body. So naturally, right, when we want to draw a character that we're interested in, we're also really interested in capturing like the face and the head, and the area where you can see the most personality and the most emotion. And last but not least, of course, right, all these ties into being able to connect with it personally a lot easier, right? As you're drawing, it's easier to be like invested in a drawing where you're drawing like a character who is has emotions, has like which is visible, right, as compared to just drawing like a zoom in shot of like the hands, or like a far away shot or something like that. So this is kind of explanation as to why they are useful and why we like to do them. So before we go into the demo part, I also wanted to talk about some of the basic components of portraits. So here are a couple of items that I think can be, in a sense, listed as like the basis on which we build our knowledge. So number one, one thing we want to figure out when we are doing a portrait is to figure out the overall gesture of the head and neck. So notice that I didn't say anatomy, but I said gesture. Of course, anatomy is really important, especially when you learn more about portraits and then you get into drawing them more realistically, or you want to figure out how exactly the gesture works and how they interact. But as a really, really basic level thing, right, you may not, immediately need to understand all that really complicated stuff. So in a sense, right, gesture is more of kind of getting a feeling of what things sort of might look like, and what things, or rather how things kind of flow. So in this situation, we want to figure out the gesture, the neck and head, so we can have like the natural feeling flow, right, for the character. And then number two, we want to perhaps also look at some more precise things, right? Like the perspective and anatomy of the head or neck area. So this is really fundamental stuff. However, in a way, there are also many levels to approach this, this part of the component of the basic components, right? Because in the fundamental stuff, there's still like the fundamental of the fundamental and the more advanced part of the like fundamentals. So it's not black and white, but it is one thing we want to keep in mind, right? Eventually, we will have to tackle this part. And then number three is, once you basically have a good idea of the overall kind of like position, or you're able to kind of depict like a portrait that is recognizably a portrait that is fairly proficient, right? One thing you want to do is to be able to present expressions, right? Sort of understand how each feature on the face comes together to convey a certain look that you want, right? Like for example, if you want a character to look more serious, you know, what things do you change? Or you want them to look more happy and relaxed, what things do you change, right? And last but not least, we also want to learn how to deal with hair. So for this entire page, right, we're talking about basic components, and this is really more for your kind of reference and more like a checklist to be like, okay, so these are sort of the things I need to deal with in like the mid-term, right? Not the long term, because eventually you will get more advanced beyond these, but in the mid-term. But for today's video, the scope is going to be a little bit narrower because I really want to keep things simple, right? I don't want to essentially have like a video where it's too short for me to explain all the details of how I exactly construct, you know, a character's face and everything, right? Because since I actually intended, or rather since I really wanted this to be a quick starter guide, I want to really just bring up a few things that I think even beginners can really use to help themselves in the process of learning. So I really want to avoid anything too advanced, and I want to keep to these two things that everyone starting from beginners can really just make use of immediately and then pay attention to and then reap the rewards. Yeah, and so without further ado, let's take a look at item number 1, analyzing reference. So the first item that we're talking about is analyzing reference. So one of the ways I really believe in learning is to observe and then understand. So in this age where we can have access to all kinds of photo materials and reference materials pretty much instantly, I think it would be really a waste if we were to ignore this really important and useful pool of resources. So in this part, I want to talk about how we can make use of them and make good use of them to improve our own art. And so here, let's talk about some of the important things that we need to do in order to accomplish that. So firstly, I want to talk about figuring out the gesture or action of, say, the person in the reference, independent of the camera angle. So what do I mean? Right, for example, let's take a look at this first person in this corner over here. So immediately when we look at it, right, if we are very new to drawing, we may not have like this instinct or this, you know, like reaction to immediately start analyzing the actual pose or the actual situation, right? We might just think, okay, we want to draw like the chest, and we want to draw the abs, and then we want to draw like, you know, this shape in the neck and all these things. So when we analyze it instead, right, instead of just trying to directly take, we'll notice a couple of things. So for example, we'll notice that the character's head is almost side on to us, but not completely, right? So this is one thing we want to take note of. However, the character's body is sort of more towards us and not aligned with the head. So what I mean is, for example, the character's body is like this. This is the front, and these are like the shoulders. The head of the character isn't looking straight ahead, right? It's looking slightly to this person's right, sort of like this. So this is kind of like one thing that I think is really important to pay attention to when we are analyzing references. Because sometimes we can find a reference that we want for our art and be like, okay, so this is what we can refer to. But if we just transfer things directly, right, we end up possibly ending up with like a pose that could be realistic because we copied it really exactly, but it's not what we want at all. And by that time, you might have spent a lot of energy on painting and all that, drawing in all the detail, and then it may not be like it may not be productive at all, and then you just waste a lot of time having to redo, and it's very frustrating. So this is kind of why one thing I usually always recommend is to begin with figure out the gesture and action independent of the camera angle. Right, the same thing with this lady in this photo here. Her sort of torso is facing in this direction, right? But her head is a bit more towards us. So again, right, this is also a case of like the character isn't looking straight ahead. Oh, and this is like a nuance that I feel is quite important, because For example, if you align the arms with like the body, and everything is aligned with the body, right, and not with the head, but you didn't realize that the head is sort of slightly angled, you will just end up with a really awkward pose. Or if you copy everything wholesale, right, as I mentioned before, you may end up with having a pose that you actually didn't want, right? And then moving on to like this particular photo here. For example, you can see this person is actually reclining, right? Like this person is reclining. His torso is not like straight down, but it's more reclined. Like he's leaning back. You can see like his torso is sort of like leaning, like facing like at like a 45-degree or slightly less angle, but the arm is like straight down. So he's putting his weight on his arm. His upper arm is here, and then there's like this lower arm here where it's very foreshortened, and then we can see his hand and his thumb. And then you can also notice that, for example, his left shoulder, our right, is higher than his right shoulder, which is leaning on, say, I imagine like an armrest of a chair. So all this information, right, when we look at it and pay attention to it, it's going to tell us what kind of gesture or what kind of energy the pose currently has. So why this is important is because before we can absorb and use the reference, we have to understand it really clearly. And in order to do so, right, we have to sort of figure out their action. And again, right, as I have just said, we have to pay close attention to usually the relationship between the torso and the head, and that actually is a good starting point to sort of look at for the references. So same with this lady here, right? We'll notice that we have to pay close attention to how her body is angled relative to her head as well. So we're pretty much side on to her head, but she's slightly tilted towards the camera, which is why, right, we can see this eye and this part of her cheeks right here. Because if she was completely side on, like, we'll see very, very little of this area here, you know, right, on the other side of the face. So that's one thing, right? Another thing is notice how far she is tilted towards us. So normally when we look at this like independently, right, if you just look at this head area, we'll think, okay, so this character is pretty much like side on to us, and we're looking at her side of her head, and she's slightly looking at us. But if we pay attention to like her body language, she's actually really turning her head pretty hard, right? Notice how we can actually see a good amount of her back, right? So her torso is like halfway towards back facing us, but her face is like almost side on to us. So this is important because sometimes, right, we can end up drawing a character or a person or whoever, right, while using reference, we can misunderstand a reference and then we turn their head way too much. Like, for example, the character's head here is almost side on, because if we didn't realize that her back is almost halfway towards facing us directly, we in our minds we'll think like, okay, she can actually turn her head a bit further, it won't be a problem. But in reality, if you accidentally, you know, like misunderstand a reference, it'll just look like someone's head is really turning very far backwards unnaturally. So this is another example of why we need to figure out this thing independent of the camera angle. And I say this because when we are using a reference and we're possibly transferring the pose to our own work, we may not really pay attention. We may not use the same camera angle, right? So we have to make sure the pose itself and the relationship between each of the components, like the head, the neck, and the torso, they meet our requirements, right? Before even involving, you know, all the camera stuff. And so next, right, we've touched on point 1, now we touch on point 2. So next we have to figure out the camera angle and focal length. So this is also important because sometimes we want to capture the framing of a portrait, right? We may not be there exactly for the pose, but we may be there for the framing. So if we take this example here on the right, let's say we want to borrow the framing, but we want to change the pose. So we have to figure out what kind of framing we're looking at. So in this situation, I would say, I would hazard a guess that it is probably a slightly wider lens taken indoors. Right, that's just a guess. And what that's going to tell us is that if we were to add more components, like if we were to add the character's hand, like off in the distance, right? Let's say the thumb is here and she's like touching the wall. So if we were to add this, right, our understanding of the camera being used and all the other things, right? If we want to preserve sort of this cinematic feel, is that this hand has to be like corresponding to the same sort of scene, right? Because we can't draw a hand that's being shot in different camera lens or with the different focal length than the rest of this character. So again, there's a lot more for this part in the perspective video. So I will recommend you to check that out as well, since it touches on some really basic things about how to look at references. But for the purposes of this portrait video, I just want everyone to pay attention to sort of the proportion of the head and the proportion relative to the shoulders. So that is going to give us a lot of information on how wide the lens is or how long the focal length is, right? For example, in the first character, you can see everything is pretty much proportionate. There is not a lot of distortion going on. There's still a little bit, right? For example, this hand is a little bit bigger than this one in appearance because it's nearer to the camera. And usually this is sort of like a telltale sign that the camera is near the subject, and then there's a bit of more lens distortion going on as well. Right, and for example, right, in this photo, things feel a bit more proportional because what is likely here is that the photographer is quite a distance away and is like taking a shot of this model or this lady here with a longer lens. So that's going to keep things a bit more in proportion. So, right, something to pay attention to as well. Again, more of this in the perspective video. There are two parts to it and you can watch it to understand this better. So last but not least, right, as a beginner, this could be a lot of work, but I just want to sort of emphasize that you don't have to do everything to its maximum immediately. I think what is good is if you're able to sort of slightly understand the reason why these are important and then try to apply them a little bit at a time, right? For example, especially with complex portraits like this, where you have like a more of a Dutch angle. I'm not sure if that's the correct use of the terminology. Sort of like a very low angle, right? And then you have like the character also tilting her head in like a pose that people don't usually draw, right? When you combine these two, this can be really tough and challenging to process, right? So for example, this reference here would be a lot more digestible, and yeah, and again, just pay attention to these and then try your best, right? So that is really just the goal of this tutorial, to sort of let you know some of the really basic things that you can start pay attention to. Right, and so this sort of concludes the first part, analyzing reference. I don't want to drag it on for too long. And so in the next part, I want to talk about understanding the core structure of the face, mainly the face and the neck area, and then highlighting a few points that you can begin with. So moving on to the final part of the tutorial, where I would like to do a small demo to demonstrate some of the core structures or some of the core points about the structure of the head and, you know, portrait drawing that you can start implementing immediately, or at least pay attention to and keep note of. Right, so I've chosen this reference because it's pretty simple in terms of camera angle and stuff. So without further ado, let's begin. So immediately when I begin, I usually like to just lay out the dimension of things really roughly, nothing too complicated here. But one thing I want to pay attention to is that I would, if possible, like to sort of think about how the neck intersects the head. Now this is usually important because sometimes when we draw this sort of portraits, we kind of forget that there is a significant area under the chin that really isn't neck, right? If we take a look at this particular reference here, right, there's quite a big area under the chin that has nothing to do with the neck. It's only like halfway to the ear, from the eye, halfway, almost more than halfway to the ear, where really the neck begins. So sometimes when we're drawing like a forward-facing camera angle, we want to pay attention to this as well, right? Same with this second step, where we also want to preserve this. But in the second step, the most important event going on here is that we have to start figuring out the center line of the face. And this comes with a couple of caveats as well. So bear with me for a moment, right? The center line is oftentimes really easily misplaced because we don't pay enough attention to what pose or what angle or what gesture we want exactly, right? It's easy to misplace this too far to the here, or easy to misplace this too far to here. And either of those is going to create or give our drawing a different gesture and, you know, appearance really than what we might want. So again, pay close attention to where you put the center line. So following that up, here is another main point that I want to talk about that you can pay attention to right now. So here we go, right? Normally we tend to see, right, the character's face as three parts. So usually there's the front of the face, and then there's a side, and then there are two sides of the face. So what I want you to do is to put conscious effort into recognizing this fact. So what do I mean? When we draw a character's face, rather than be like, okay, so this is the front of the face, and then we see one side of the face, right? We want to pay close attention to the angle that we are looking at our portrait, and then pay very close attention to how much of each of the three surfaces we can see, right? In this situation, we can actually see all three surfaces, right? Obviously, with the two side surfaces being foreshortened. Right, so on top of the portrait, if I overlay this, this is sort of like the person's right side of the face. This is the left side of the face, and this is kind of the center of the face, right? So why is this important? Because this really helps us depict how far exactly the head is turned. Because if the head is turned further this way, right, if the character turns her head this way even more, you'll notice that this part of the face doesn't show up at all, right? In fact, you'll start noticing if he turns even further, like even this part of the lips gets really foreshortened and starts disappearing as well. Eventually, you'll end up like side on from this side, which is what we see in this person, right? We only see the front of the face being foreshortened, and then the side of the face, or this side of the face. The other side is completely not visible. Right, so as a beginner, I think it would be good to start recognizing that being able to look at the face and figure out exactly which sides of the face and how much of it you're seeing is going to be really helpful in figuring out your middle line. Right, in this case, we're able to confidently place our middle line here because we know exactly how far the person's head is turned. We definitely see more of this side of the face and less of that side, right? But not completely dominated by these two. So, right, this helps us determine the position of the face really, really cleanly. And this is one thing I want everyone to pay attention to, because this is really going to help you later on as well. And then next, right, it's just a little bit of cleanup. Again, emphasizing, notice these lines. These lines, I like to emphasize that this is sort of the orientation of the head. And then as we proceed, right, I started trying to figure out some more precise things, right? Like, for example, the character's head is slightly tilted, and here is a negative example. So here, notice I tilted the drawing's head really quite a bit, and notice that actually it's tilted quite a bit more than the character's head. Since we're in a digital medium, I'm going to do a quick measure. Notice how this ear is slightly lower than this one. Yeah, the character head, the person's head is slightly tilted, but it's not as much as here, right? So again, if possible, take your time to carefully observe and then implement. All right, this is a negative example. Right, but something else that is going on here is that once we are sort of done with the very basic structure of the head, the next thing I want you to pay attention to is the shoulders and the neck and shoulder area. The really important thing about the neck and shoulder area is it's going to be extremely impactful in the impression with which your piece is received, because shoulders contribute a lot to body language. If you have tensed shoulders or relaxed shoulders, it's going to really, really, really obvious from any pose. So yeah, if anything, do remember this part as well, right? The 10 shoulders. I'm going to mark it in red. Excuse me, I'm going to mark it in red. Right, so the 10 shoulders is really important, right? So is this one. So in this case, the model is pretty relaxed, so we want to make sure to correct that. So as you can see in our final drawing on the right, we kind of want to make sure that we don't, accidentally sort of give her shoulders a bump, because that's going to give like a false impression, right, of her being sort of more uptight than she actually is. Apologies for skipping ahead a bit. Let's get back to the next step. So after we've basically understood and constructed our sketch with, the understanding of the 3 main regions, and then make sure our shoulders, the shoulder of our character in the portrait is sort of lined up, I like to start. This is the part where I start placing in the facial features. I start with the eyes and the ears because I think they are good anchor points to tell us how the head of the character is tilted, and they're also conveniently aligned in like this sort of neutral forward-looking pose, right? And by doing this first, it also gonna help us sort of figure out, if like the gaze of the character fits the angle of the head. Is it corresponding to the reference, or is it corresponding to our own ideas well enough? And then once we are done with this, right, we can continue painting the other features like the nose and the mouth. And then one thing I want to pay attention to here is, as we paint the nose and the mouth, again, we want to align it into this this 3 region split, right? And notice that how the nose, or excuse me, the mouth, or the corners of the mouth actually really just mark the turning point between these major surfaces, right? Like this area here is on one surface, this entire frontal area with all our facial features is on like this sort of main forward facing plane, and then we have this like side cheek. And again, this is really important to understand even when like we're placing our facial features. And so sometimes when you're struggling on where exactly do I place my mouth, draw yourself some guidelines to sort of refresh on the 3 surfaces, and then you can use that to sort of guide your placement of your facial features. And this is where I actually want to stop, because I feel like just by understanding the concept of this part and then making use of the knowledge of knowing that you have to pay attention to this, as well as basic gestural stuff like the shoulders and some of the basic placement of facial features, I feel like these are the real sort of theory or concept points I want to highlight, because I think it's not necessary for me to tell you like, hey, actually, the side of the nose is also a plane, and then the bottom of the nose, there's also like a plane here, there's also like a plane here, there's also like a plane here. I think I definitely would rather trust everyone to sort of pick up on this slightly more advanced knowledge about the form as they move along and at their own pace. So this is why in this tutorial, if there's anything you take away, do remember this, right? When you draw a face, make sure you know exactly where the neck is, right? Connect it. When you connect it in 2D, sometimes it's good to draw X-ray view. And then after that, as you are drawing the face and figuring out how to tilt the face and so on, make sure you pay attention to the 3 planes of the face. That is really going to be the core of getting a portrait to look right. And then also pay a bit of attention to the shoulders, because they are really they are quite a big sticking point. And then last but not least, as you put in the features, right, continue paying attention to the 3 main surfaces. And so this is pretty much it for this part of demo, and pretty much the end of the tutorial. So hopefully this has been more digestible than usual, because normally I talk about more of intermediate stuff, but today I try my best to keep it contained to 1 or 2 things that you can just start doing immediately. Again, this is not where it ends. There's a lot more to talk about on this topic, and there's a lot more for you to explore yourself as well. So yeah, this is it for this tutorial. Hopefully it has been helpful, and always feel free to ask questions in the comments or leave any feedback. So thank you, and I hope to see you next month.